Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us for this webinar with Piana Consulting and with Laura. So this webinar is a continuation of a series that we launched last month with Deb Halliday called Collaborate for Impact, which was sort of about the how do you sort of find your way in your community and your environment and find some different partners that you think might be good collaborative partners to help navigate the normal that we find ourselves in today. We find ourselves in some pretty uncharted territory, and we definitely feel like we as MNA and as the sector here in Montana, that we will do this work best if we do it together. We do it in conjunction with our partners and with those in our community who are also trying to accomplish the same ends we are. This series is a continuation of that series, and also serves as a bridge between this work and a deep dive session that La Piana is going to offer at the MNA conference next month, which goes deeper into a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about here today on strategic restructuring. So the work we talked about earlier this month and into July was just around sort of the cultural aspects and the qualitative aspects of how do you find a dance partner? How do you find someone to collaborate with and integrate your services with in whatever form or fashion that might look like? This is going to be a little more tactical in regards to how do you actually do this work? What's required from a legal responsibility, and also just all the different nuts and bolts that go into formal collaboration, whether that be MOUs all the way up to merger and assumption of service. So we're very glad to have Laura Jakubowski with La Piana Consulting. La Piana is one of the national experts in this work, in mergers and acquisitions and in restructuring and in all that stuff that we're going to talk about here today. We're glad she's here. She will also be with us at the MNA conference to do a multiple part series on these same topics, but in much more depth. So we are glad to have Laura here. We will send out the slides and the materials when this is done. And if you didn't have a chance to access the first 3 parts of what I would call part of this series, the Collaborate for Impact, you can find that on our training calendar. We'll also send a link out, but you can also access all those materials as well if this conversation sparks something that you'd like to learn more about in the future. So thank you, Laura, for being here. We're very glad to have you, and take it away.
Thanks, Adam. I really appreciate it. We're really excited to be here with you guys today. Again, my name's Laura Jakubowski. I'm with La Piana Consulting. I'm joined by my colleague Madison McAleese. Our firm is a national firm that works only with nonprofits and foundations. We work a lot on nonprofit mergers and restructurings, collaborations, partnerships. And so we're going to tell you a little bit about our work today. So our agenda for today is to go a little bit deeper into the work that you've been doing on the collaboration series. So I'm really excited that you guys have gotten familiar with a lot of that, that language and that terminology. What we're going to do is dive into how we define strategic restructurings, which is a term that we use for sort of a whole gamut of ways that nonprofits work together. And then we're going to talk about the process, because the process can really be used no matter what kind of partnership or collaboration you're looking at. So let's start off with just some basic terminology around strategic restructuring. And again, there's a lot of words that folks use, collaboration and integration. We use strategic restructuring because we talk about a lot of different ways that nonprofits work together. And over the last 20 years, we've worked with lots of different nonprofits in a lot of different ways. So we want to sort of talk about it under that big umbrella. And really, it's all about how nonprofits come together to sort of advance their missions. And we really have that old adage about form following function. So we don't presume that we're talking about any particular type of nonprofit collaboration or partnership until we see what is the vision that you have, and then what's the form that's going to support that. So all of these things build on collaboration, but they can be different, especially when there's a change in the locus of control. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. But we want to just emphasize that Sometimes mergers and a lot of the terms that we throw around in this can sound kind of scary to folks, but I want to just emphasize that this is just another tool that you have as a nonprofit leader in terms of figuring out what's the best way to accomplish my mission. And we're seeing increasingly organizations really thinking about it as a way to increase impact, to accomplish growth, and to remain competitive. So we're going to talk about what we call the collaborative map. And I was looking through the slides that you all have used if you were part of that 3-part series on collaboration. And so I just want to talk about our map and how it connects, I think, to some of the work that you've been doing. I think there was a chart in your last webinar, or one of the most recent ones, that was from the Tamarack Institute, who I love. And if you remember, there were sort of a whole series of ways that organizations could work together. And kind of at the far right end, I think it was like a collaboration column and then an integration column. So our map kind of overlaps with that. I would say that where this green outer circle, and I'm going to talk about some of these items in here, that green outer circle would be what Tamarack refers to as collaboration, and that's what we're calling collaboration. And then what we're doing is we're going deeper on the integration. That far right side of the Tamarack table, I think, equates to the blue and the yellow circles here. And for us, those two, the blue and the yellow, is where we get into more formal agreements. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that outer green circle is what we would consider kind of looser collaboration. It involves working together, but not necessarily with agreements. As you move into that blue circle, we've got a fiscal sponsorship, coalitions, affinity groups, administrative consolidation, a joint earned income venture, an association, a consortium, joint programming. So ways that nonprofits work together, there's usually an agreement, some kind of expectation of future commitments among the nonprofits, but there's not a change in control. And when we get into that most inner circle, that's the yellow or gold circle, we call that strategic restructuring just because it's the most intensive form of all of this. It includes mergers, parent subsidiaries, joint ventures where you're creating a new entity together, asset transfers where one group is transferring control of something to another, and then MSOs, which are managed service organizations. So our next slide is going to go into this a little bit more deeply. I want to pause right now just to say, if you have questions, there's a lot, as Adam alluded to, this is getting into a lot of nuts and bolts. There's a lot of terminology and language that I'm going to be using. And if any of it's confusing, please go into the chat, type your questions. Madison's going to be feeding those to me throughout the next hour, and please don't hesitate to ask your questions. So again, collaborative map at La Piana, we have the outer ring, which is collaboration, the blue ring, which is alliances, where there's some sort of agreement, and then the yellow in the middle is where there's a change in control. So right now, what I'm going to do when I switch slides is I'm going to like slice into this pie, and we're going to look at a cross section of it. And I know this can look like a lot of information. We're going to send, I understand that Adam and Shelby are going to be sending the slides out, so you'll get to kind of delve more deeply into this. But again, if you think of this slide as a cross section of the last slide, we've got our core, and that yellow was in the inner part of the circle. The blue was the alliances in the middle, and then the green was the outer collaboration side. And so let's start at the outer area around the green for collaboration. So again, we're defining collaboration as ways that you might work with other nonprofits, but you're not changing any decision making. You're each running your own organizations. You have more autonomy. You might be information sharing. You might be coordinating on your programs. You might be doing joint planning. The dotted line between the green and the blue indicates that there's some kind of contract or MOU. An MOU is a memorandum of understanding. And so this blue area in the middle that we call sort of strategic alliances involves a commitment for the future. You're creating a way to make decisions together, and you're documenting those decisions in an agreement. So we have administrative consolidation and joint programming. And if you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's an axis, this axis over here, which lays out sort of the difference between administrative consolidation and joint programming. So as we go up on this chart, the administrative consolidation is more focused on, we're just trying to share back office services, and joint programming is more focused on the program that we're doing together. And that is just helpful as you're thinking about different ways that you're working with other organizations. It helps to streamline what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. And we just offer that as a way to sort of facilitate your thinking about potential ways that you might be working with other organizations. And then if we move to the yellow or golden part over here on the right, this is again that inner circle of the collaborative map. This is where we're seeing greater integration. The solid line that divides the blue from the yellow is where we see a change in corporate structure. So this is when we might have an organization that dissolves, or an organization that is subsumed by another organization, or two organizations that dissolve and merge into one new organization. So there's a lot of different ways, and this is really the area that we're going to go into a lot of detail on, just to sort of illustrate some of these ideas. Again, we'll talk about a management services organization, which is focused on the administration side, a parent subsidiary corporation, a merger, asset transfers, which are becoming more and more common, and then a joint venture corporation. And again, we just want to call to your attention sort of the way we define these, thinking about them in terms of whether or not you have an agreement. So that might be in the blue area, or if you're talking about a change in control or a change in structure, and that would be in the gold. So let's talk about what we're seeing in the market. We're seeing more and more nonprofits using mergers and collaborations to better position themselves, to improve their competitive position against whatever challenges are facing them. And we know with COVID, that's happening a lot. So we are seeing a lot of increased activity in the sector. We're getting a lot more calls from folks, and folks are doing projects in a sort of sped up, accelerated way. We're seeing a lot of national organizations that are looking at this, affiliated organizations where you might have affiliates in different regions wanting to come together. We're seeing a lot of interest in administrative consolidation, wanting to share back office services. We're also seeing interest from funders, not just around two groups coming together, but maybe a whole bunch of, there might be 3 or 4 youth organizations that if they've been collaborating, there's some interest in, would you guys all want to come together? So we're doing a lot of multi-organization partnerships and mergers. And of course, COVID-19, some people are calling it, just a very, concerning situation for nonprofits, and I'm sure you're all intimately aware of that. But that's certainly accelerating a lot of these issues. Okay, so why do people go down this path? I know you've been spending a lot of time talking about collaboration, but let's just talk about some of the reasons why folks think about restructurings. So a lot of times people focus on short-term savings, but I will say that, and I think that can sometimes be helpful. There are some savings to be had if you have some duplication, but what we find is that it's really a long-term, less of a direct savings, more of an indirect savings that are the most powerful motivations for this. It's really taking a long view. And the other reason folks look at this is in terms of opportunities. Right now, some folks are looking at this because they're not sure how long their runway is with COVID going on, but there's also, we're seeing a lot of organizations both before COVID and after that are focus now on sort of growth and increasing their impact and figuring out how to just meet their mission, and needing to think about that in terms of partnerships. Leadership challenges, we've got, sometimes we have, baby boomers who are retiring. There are changes or vacuums, and so there's an opportunity to think about coming together with other organizations. Sometimes we have boards that it's to attract new board members, and so it becomes an opportunity to think about reinvigorating the board by joining forces. Certainly to better serve the community, Madison and I were just on a call earlier today with a client, and they are coming together from 2 different regions, and what their focus at the end of the call was really on serving people better, serving people more comprehensively, and serving more people because they're coming together. And then of course there are reasons specific to each organization. In terms of success factors, you'll notice that a lot of these things have to do with how the staff and the board support the idea and work together. So, having a champion, having experience with collaboration. You've just been through all this work on collaboration, so hopefully that resonates for you guys. A strategic or a decision around changing control really is seated with the board in terms of it being a strategic decision for the organization. And so having board support and encouragement, and having a good relationship between the board and the executive team is really key. And then I just want to talk about the risk taking and growth orientation. We're not talking about day trading here, but we have nonprofits that sometimes get stuck doing things one way. And the boards might as well, and might think of their mission in a fairly narrow way. And so what this refers to is more that openness to being able to fulfill your mission in a different way or new ways, and being flexible about that. So some of these are sort of building on some of those points. So again, focusing on mission, but being flexible in that, having that alignment, having that shared vision of what you could accomplish together. Not being in an immediate crisis is super helpful because you can take some time to evaluate what your options are and how you want to structure something. Unfortunately, everyone is sort of in increasingly more stressful financial times. So again, the sooner you kind of think about if you want to be doing this, the better, because your runway might be shorter than you think. A lack of divisiveness, that's kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised. So again, building on good relationships that you already have and having that alignment between the staff and the board is really key. And positive relationships with potential partners. Sometimes we find that folks kind of think there's one group that they want to go and do a deeper collaboration or a formal collaboration with, when in fact there might be multiple organizations. So having sort of more folks to fill up that dance card is a good thing, because sometimes things don't follow a linear fashion. So just having good partnership relationships is super helpful. So what are some of the roadblocks? You might have covered some of these in the collaboration series, but I'll just reiterate. Concerns around autonomy, concerns around trust. I was recently working with a client, and we were toward the end of a negotiation, and once I started asking a lot more questions about things that we had kind of already covered. And so I had to kind of investigate whether they had lost trust in the other partner, or if those were just a little bit of, a little bit of fright at the fact that this was coming and it was going to be real. But that trust is really key. We also see self-interest. This is why we want to have board and staff both involved. This isn't really meant in a malicious way at all. It's just that sometimes it's hard if positions might become duplicative. It can be hard for folks to see sort of how to move forward if it's somehow affecting their position. And so we have to kind of work through that. And then of course, cultures, you know, a hierarchical culture versus a sort of a flatter culture. And I mean, there are a lot of cultural issues, and we're going to talk about that a lot more in a little bit. So we want to turn to the process now. So again, feel free to jump in with any questions. And I apologize if I'm moving fast, but I want to cover the process that we go through, because no matter whether you're in that green ring, the blue ring, or that inner yellow ring, you'll probably want to follow along with this process. I think it's just a good set of steps to take. It's certainly, we're going to talk more about being in that most inner yellow circle, but I think all of the principles that we're going to cover are applicable to any approach that you have. So we're going to first talk about the assessment process, but just to give you an overview, you kind of go from assessment, you sort of resolve that you want to go into negotiations. When you complete your negotiations, if you choose to proceed, you usually have an agreement of some kind that is approved by your boards, and then you go into an implementation process that involves legal and then the cultural stuff. But right now we're going to just focus in on the assessment process. And you might be in a process already or be thinking about a process with an existing partner, and you might say, you know, we're already further down the line in this, but hopefully just understanding this whole process will help you think through maybe steps that you might have missed. So in terms of assessment, we actually have an online tool that we use with organizations that want to think about this, so they can sort of self-assess what their motivations are, what outcomes they might want from a potential partnership or collaboration, what their critical issues are. We have a client currently in an East Coast state, and the state has kind of said, we're only going to contract with folks who are over a certain budget amount. And both of these organizations are under that amount. And so it makes sense for them to come together. But identifying those kind of critical issues that you might be facing in your landscape is part of this kind of self-assessment issue. You know, understanding if you have any red flags, if there are any concerns. Sometimes we have folks that have lines of credit that are haven't been able to be paid down. You just want to understand, especially if there are financial situations, where you are in that. If you don't have a partner that you've identified, you can think about some of these questions in the middle here. You know, and I think you've actually covered some of this in some of the collaboration work, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. What I would zero in on is this last one about bringing new programs, geography, or funding to a partnership. This one to me is sort of a filling the gap. Where can you solve a problem for both of you? I had one client where one organization had done a public presentation on their strategic plan, and the other organization was in the audience and learned during that presentation that they were trying to create a new program that the other organization already did. And so they approached them and said, hey, you know, we're already doing this thing that you're talking about starting. Do you want to join forces? And they ended up merging. So, you know, thinking about where you could fill a gap for someone else. And then assessing your potential partners. And I think, again, maybe some of this is overlap from what you talked about in your collaboration series, thinking about trust, what your past experiences are with collaboration. And then this usable skills and assets. You know, sometimes I have groups that approach one another and think that, like, on paper, it does look like it could be a good match and that they make sense to work together. But one organization might have a great fundraising capacity, and the other organization might think, hey, that would be great because we don't have that fundraising capacity. So it looks like that would make a lot of sense. Sometimes upon examination, that might not actually be a usable skill or asset because that fundraising operation might not have a lot of bandwidth to expand and to take on the work of another organization. And it's only those organizations that can figure out, is this doable or not? And that's part of what we go through in this assessment process. But just to keep in mind that even though something on paper might look like it would work, the timing might be off, or the ability to focus on these kinds of conversations might be off. And so you want to kind of be sussing that out in this assessment period. Okay. So again, think about the market, where you're currently positioned in it, and how you got to where you are. This kind of ties into the piece that we're going to be doing in September and October, a two-part series where we're going to be doing a taking stock webinar and then sort of a strategic direction webinar to kind of think about your organization and what your strengths are and where you have some gaps. But if you're thinking about this assessment stage, you're thinking about, you know, who are the other organizations in the market? What are their strengths and weaknesses? Who might be good partners? Sometimes folks worry about competition, but oftentimes those are the most interesting partnership conversations because you're already in the same space. And if you can find a way to streamline your approach and do that with a positive, trusting relationship, there's actually, you know, a lot of opportunity for growth there. And then, of course, you know, all of the sort of challenges that are going on in the market, and I know now is a tough time to be thinking about those because there's so much uncertainty. But that is sort of part of the assessment process, is just to start thinking through what the opportunities are. So let's move on within the assessment process. Let's say that you've identified a partner and you feel pretty good, like there's a potential here. It's really important to make sure that the board and staff of your organization and the board and staff of the other organization are all on the same page. And we usually see that documented through a board resolution that lays out what you're going to do, who's going to, you know, be delegated to explore this. It doesn't commit anyone to any kind of specific decision. It just authorizes folks to go into the negotiations process to explore the potential for an alliance or for a partnership. It lays out how you're going to keep each other informed, who's going to be on this, you know, negotiations committee, and what the time frame might be. So we just, you know, offer this as just a suggestion. Again, the nuts and bolts of how to make sure everyone is on the same page. The other piece that is really key here is a lot of times folks are are concerned about things getting public before there's really anything to announce. And so if you want to have a confidentiality agreement, both parties should do that, and you would probably want to lay out some of these things. So if you're going to be sharing documents, you know, how those get returned or what they could be used for, any disclosures to third parties. Sometimes when we're involved as a third party consultant, to be sort of a neutral party, you want to clarify, and we, you know, of course, honor that commitment to not disclose anything to anyone else. You don't want somebody else using the information for competitive purposes. And then you just want to have some clarity around how you're going to handle any kind of public communications. If word gets out, how you'll respond. If you proceed, how you'll even talk to staff or external folks. So we have lots of examples of confidentiality agreements and board resolutions as well. So, you know, certainly consider us a resource if you are in a situation where you want to learn more about that. Okay, so let's move on to the negotiation stage. And again, if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. So once you've decided as an organization, we want to explore this idea, let's go into negotiations with our potential partner, what we recommend in this process is that you create a negotiations committee that's made up of designated folks from both of the organizations. sometimes we often have some staff involved, but it should be folks on the board. We like to have a range of both folks who are good big champions of this idea. They might have come up with the idea, and then some folks who might be a little bit more skeptical, so that we know that we're hearing all the different sides. We don't necessarily want that to be a huge committee, but we wanted to have a lot of different perspectives. So that committee would meet. We usually meet, over 4 to 6 months, or 4 to 6 times now. Since it's with Zoom, we're not doing a lot of in-person. And they're negotiating issues that have been identified, and they're overseeing a due diligence process to learn whatever information they need to know before they can make a recommendation back to their respective boards with some kind of agreement around how a partnership might work. And this graphic assumes they come up with something that would work. They would have this agreement with all of the different things that they've agreed to, like the name and what the board might look like and what the structure might take on. That goes back to each board. They each, presumably in this graphic, approve that. And then we go into this implementation phase in the blue arrow, where we do legal documents and things like that, and then go into integration. So just to go a little bit deeper again into negotiations, these 6 items on the left are the areas that we find folks needing to negotiate. So certainly governance, financials. Are there assets that are being transferred, or what is the, whose accounting system will we use? What will the fiscal year be? Is anyone assuming any liabilities for anyone else? In terms of human resources, we're looking at staffing, titles, benefits, salary levels, org chart. Capital is also facilities. So what offices will remain open? Where will they be located? If you have a building, how will that be handled? If you own something. And then program, I actually generally put program at the top of the list, because I usually, again, form following function, want to figure out what's the shared program that we're doing. How is our impact going to change? How will we be connecting our programs? Will we be providing sort of comprehensive referrals? How is that programmatic piece going to be integrated? And then communications. How are we going to talk about this? This middle piece is sort of what consultants do during the negotiations process. So we are preparing agendas for these meetings. We're facilitating the negotiations. We're tracking what you're agreeing to. We're often doing the financial due diligence and presenting that to folks. We're helping you with your communication strategy, crisis management. We're coordinating with attorneys. And then when presentations are being made to your board, we're helping you with that and following up on any loose ends.
Laura, this is a great time for one of our questions. Since most organizations don't have a lawyer on staff, at what point should an organization bring in an attorney to help guide the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way we look at it, we're not lawyers. We help organizations figure out their business agreements. So that they're ready to go to the lawyers, and the lawyers sort of implement the decisions you've made about we want to come together and be a merged organization, or we're going to dissolve one organization and we're going to have another one survive. So we want to, what I find most economical is to have a lawyer get involved when you're close to that point. I'll go back on the slide here a second. When you're kind of toward the end of this agreement stage and you're about to go toward implementation, because you want to loop the lawyer in, and you can see it on this one, kind of at this stage where you're going back to your boards to approve this, but you're pretty sure this is going to happen. Sometimes it's very helpful to have that lawyer involved in that sort of pre-final stage where you can say, here are all the things we've agreed to. Here's, I think, where we're going. What do you think? And then the lawyers will come in, after both boards have approved something, and they can sort of suggest, well, there's this way to do it or there's that way to do it, but you've already made your agreements around the business principles, how you're going to handle the staff. Are you keeping all the staff? Are you, what name you're going to use, what your fiscal year is, so that the lawyer can kind of hit the ground running with that. So I think right in that juncture, sometimes there's some trickiness to, like, can we bring them in a little bit early, because some of what they might tell us about how we could implement this might influence, some of the agreements that we're making, but it's somewhere in that sort of final stage of negotiations. Okay, I'm going to assume that answered that question. And let's go on to implementation. And actually, it's a perfect segue into this, because we're going to talk about the different ways that you can implement whatever structure you come up with. So I'm going to talk through this, and again, if it starts to get wonky, please ask questions so that I can clarify. So we're looking here at 3 different structures, and we're going to look at 2 more after this, but couldn't fit everything on one slide. So these are kind of classic options around what folks will tend to call sort of mergers and acquisitions. So in options 1 and 2, folks will tend to call these acquisitions. We don't like the word acquisition because no one's really buying anything. But basically, we have one corporation B that's going away and being subsumed into corporation A. And in option 3, we have 2 organizations that are coming together into a new corporation. So we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So in option 1, we have corporation B, which is coming over sort of with everything. They're bringing their assets and their liabilities, and they're coming over into corporation A. And once all of those assets and liabilities are moved over, corporation B goes away. And so the lawyers, would do a dissolution of that corporation B. Oftentimes, it's it just depends on the situation. Maybe corporation B has a mortgage or something, and so that's fine. You can move that over to corporation A. But sometimes, if there are liabilities that need to be sort of paid down, you don't want to bring them over. You look at option 2, which is corporation B goes through and sort of gets rid of everything, basically, discharges its liabilities, and then its assets are left to corporation A. So there's a dissolution. You'll see in your articles of incorporation and bylaws, there's often a clause for, if our organization goes away, our assets should be transferred to another nonprofit that is in the same line of work. So what you do is you dissolve that organization, and then you say, okay, we're transferring everything over to A. And then in number 3, this is where we have both entities dissolve because they're forming a new entity, and they transfer everything over into this new entity, and folks create a new 501c3. Sometimes that becomes onerous because you have to find get a new IRS ruling. So I see this happening less and less because it's easier to keep somebody's EIN number and somebody's IRS certification rather than creating something new. But there are reasons, obviously, to form a new entity. And then I want to talk a little bit about interlocking boards, because this is often ties into a parent subsidiary setup. So a lot of times we see sort of an interim step where 2 organizations come together, they create a board that has overlap or sort of has connections enough so that, that they act kind of as one, or there's enough sort of shared interest that they kind of, even though they're separate entities, they kind of act as one. And then, and your lawyer will recommend all of these different iterations, but after the merger, then you form that new corporation. Sometimes this is really important if one or both of these organizations have contracts or grants that are maybe multi-year, and you don't want to change your structure until those contracts have ended. So you're figuring out these sort of interim steps. And that ties into sometimes with a parent subsidiary relationship, where we have one organization that might take sort of a controlling, might have like the majority of the seats on the board of another organization. And that's sometimes what we often see is that this parent subsidiary setup is sort of an interim step before a full-on merger, although there are some examples that have survived for years and years where they've kept this parent subsidiary relationship. So just want that to kind of be out there because it's certainly an interesting option. So in addition to those three, I want to just talk about a couple more things that that are in that yellow circle that we talked about at the beginning. One being a managed services organization. And we're seeing more and more of this where we have a number of organizations, they might all be working in the same space. Just talking recently to a group that they all do human services, they all do a lot of the same billing, and they want to form an organization that basically relieves all of them of some of those duties and consolidates that in some staff that will then they could have a sort of a higher capacity or higher level expertise. So before they do that, everyone is sort of separate. And then after they create an MSO, there's sort of two things that happen. They create this MSO, so they're all part of the governance structure of that organization, but then they all receive services from that MSO. So it's kind of this kind of closed circuit approach. And again, a really something that a lot of folks are thinking about these days. And then asset transfer I wanted to talk about because this is also becoming very common when we're not necessarily talking about two full organizations coming together in any one way or anyone dissolving, but it's kind of this sort of, build it or buy it thing that, you hear about sometimes in the corporate world. But we're seeing more and more that, one group might have an interesting program that they might not really be able to support anymore, or that might not be their focus anymore. But there's another organization that would start that. And I think actually I was just mentioning this client where they announced, they were talking about their strategic plan, and they announced that they were going to be going into this area. And so if Corporation A has a program that they don't want anymore and Corporation B would be starting from scratch with it, folks are finding asset transfer a nice way to kind of say, let's carve out this piece and transfer it over. So it could be staff that transfers over, it could be intellectual property, it could be databases, systems. I'm even seeing some organizations that are that are fiscally sponsored by one entity that want to move over to a different entity because they could be better aligned with other programs of that other entity. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff that's a little bit more flexible and that doesn't necessarily involve changes of the whole organization, but you're shifting, some piece, and you are having a change of control, but it's just for that one program or that one piece of what you're doing. So I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about integration. So once you've implemented whatever you've decided to do, you've collaborated, you figured out, hey, we have a partner, we want to do this. You've gone through your negotiations process, you've agreed to how you're going to work together, and you've implemented that, you've got the lawyers involved. So now you have to live together, and it's, depending on what what the extent to which you've merged your different programs, it could be a lot. So culture is kind of the biggest one. How are we doing things? Sometimes folks have built-in assumptions about how work needs to get done, what priorities there are. There might be board issues that need to be integrated, even onboarding folks or getting folks up to speed on how things work, management, staff, program, communications and marketing. And then, of course, all the different systems. And, you know, if you assume it was one of those traditional mergers where maybe you're creating a new organization, you might have to figure out how to integrate all of your finance systems, your HR systems, your technology. So not necessarily, you know, a modest task, but just want to emphasize that culture is really kind of the key here, because it's how people are implementing these things and how they're getting along. What we've learned is that, you know, having a really intentional process about that, creating rituals, honoring past rituals, and then acknowledging closure to maybe things that are not happening anymore, and creating new rituals so that the new entity or the new effort feels like it has its own culture that honors everyone's perspective. It can sometimes take a lot of time to do these things, especially if you're doing a pretty intensive strategic restructuring. So recognizing that and giving, making way for that. Communication is very, very big in this. It's sort of obvious, but it's amazing how quickly folks can feel like, okay, we've made this decision and now we're doing this, and I don't understand why everyone else isn't like moving along as quickly as I am. So, you know, keeping that open communication is very important. Really celebrating your wins, being very clear about if there are disagreements, nipping that in the bud and making sure that everything is very clear and explicit, especially around decision making. And also just listening very carefully, both internally and externally, to understand how things are being perceived or if there are course corrections that need to be made.
And Laura, a question here that so this slide seems to partly answer, but in your experience, what do you see as the biggest roadblock in merger conversations, and do most organizations work past it, or do they choose not to merge?
I love that question, actually. So I just want to, so I just was working with a client last week. They're going to be presenting to their boards next week. And I actually referenced them earlier to, this was when we talked about trust. So these guys had been working together for what, 4 or 5 months, really intense process, really big, you know, kind of thing that they're planning. And they had this situation come up where I think people are getting a little bit cold feet toward the end. And so they were asking all these questions, and it was making the other group very nervous and making them, they were saying like, we feel like you don't trust us because we feel like we've already talked about these things and you're bringing this back up again. And I really was like, oh no, this is going to fall apart, because maybe it's that underneath it all, this really can't work. But we spent a lot of time kind of really trying to take the emotion out of it and make it about what is the question that you need answered to move forward. And they did, and I'm just really proud of them, because it was hard, because they're very different sizes. They are trying to do something that's very sort of out of the box. So there aren't a lot of examples that they could follow. And they are kind of under a lot of public pressure. So I guess what I'm saying is that the biggest roadblock I've seen is getting very, it's hard to stay objective in these things because it's your organization and you feel really strongly. But it is really true that if you can stay focused on the shared vision that you have and the missions and how they align, and you can stay more objective, that you can really get through. If that shared vision and that goal is really as compelling to you as it felt in the beginning or when you were most excited about it, you will find a way to make it work. So these two groups, one group wanted to be sure that the other one was financially viable, and they resolved, after going through a bunch of things that they got each other mad about, they found a solution that would keep one group informed. The other group could provide that information, but it wasn't as onerous as what they started out with. So they really did find a way to work through it. It's like a couple that can find a way to argue productively. So the biggest roadblock I see is folks getting too emotional about things and not just staying focused on what the shared vision or the goals for that partnership are. So. And I'm happy to talk about that more. And actually, it's a good segue to this. This is the last slide before we go into more questions, is, when you hold on to your individual culture, you have to do it your way, rather than being open to, how could we achieve the goal? How can I get what we need and still achieve the goal, but honor what my partner needs in this process? So having that kind of, personal trust, and, in a lot of cases, like in the case I was just talking about, they're going to need to be working together for several years before their actual project together comes to fruition. So they have to maintain that. There could be different people that get involved. There could be changes on the boards. They really have to set up such a foundation of trust and relationships, and it can't all just be between two people. And keeping that emotion out of it is going to be really key for them. So so having that openness and being mission focused again is what I want to leave you with. So with that, I would love to hear if anyone has any other questions, anything that that you didn't get a chance to ask. This has been, yeah.
I was just going to say a question. In terms of the three options you mentioned at the beginning, the 2 dissolutions and then the organizations creating a new entity, which option is most common or most desired?
Yeah, so I'll go back to that slide. I would say that option 2 is what is most common. So the simplest, folks are usually wanting to figure out what's the simplest way to do this. And creating a whole new entity is onerous and can take a lot of time. So option 3 is usually hard. Option 1, here, I'll go back to that first slide just so. Option 1 is hard because sometimes folks don't want to take on liabilities. They don't want the uncertainty of, is this, even though you do all your financial due diligence, could there be any other liabilities that come up? So what we're left with is, it's the simplest, cleanest thing is for Corporation B to basically go away and basically transfer upon dissolution all of their assets over to Corporation A. Corporation A hires all the staff, takes over the leases, whatever, whatever software, all that stuff comes over to Corporation A, and we don't have to worry about Corporation B or any liabilities that we might not have, understood the full extent of. Now, that's just, a quick and easy way to do it. It's not, sometimes there are reasons to do all of these different things. That's what keeps it interesting for Madison and I, because every situation is very different. But I would say option 2 is probably the most streamlined. I know we're about to end here. The only last thing I wanted to say was, I know you guys all did the collaboration series, and I just want to recommend this book. You can see all my little Post-it notes in there. It's called Governance for Collaboratives. So it's by Joan Roberts. So if you are looking at something that maybe feels a little funky, doesn't exactly fit in any of these things, that could be a good resource to you.
Wonderful, Lara, thank you for that. And I'll make a note of that book and we'll link it in the resources that we send out. Just want to take a moment to thank all of you guys for being on or watching the recording afterwards, and thank Lara and Madison for walking us through this. Really great content. If you were able to take advantage of the collaboration webinar series that happened earlier this summer, hopefully that is a nice bridge for you. And if not, you can always go back and check out that content. But really appreciate this Strategic Restructuring 101. I'm excited because I think it just provides such a nice framework and language for us to start having these conversations with each other. And will be some recommended viewing when we get questions on these topics. So thank you both so much. And I'd also like to make a note that Lara will be back for our conference this year in September to lead a deep dive on organizational change. And so, as she mentioned, really digging more into this topic and exploring it as it relates to you as an organization. And so we hope you guys can join us for that. We'll send a link to register. Lara and Madison, thank you guys so much. And thanks to La Piana for being here. We appreciate it, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. If you need anything in the interim, don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you all.